Welcome back to the Change Physician Podcast. I am your host, Dr. Melissa Cady, joined by my co-host, Dr. Kevin Caccaro, and we are here with our guest, Dr. Marcy Larson, who's a general pediatrician. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Awesome. Well, I know that your journey has some unique twists and turns and transitions, but we always want to start from the beginning. And do you mind telling the audience why you chose to go into medicine in the first place?
I tell people all the time that I really started and became a physician because of in spite of what happened to my family, actually. So growing up as a kid, I just didn't have much exposure to medicine at all. I would go to my yearly checkups. That was about it. I lived in rural Iowa, so we just had a family practice doctor, and that was my total exposure until my mother was diagnosed with breast cancer when I was just before my sophomore year of high school. So she obviously started going through treatments, and we became very familiar very quickly with the medical system. And then a year later, my dad was diagnosed with colon cancer. So the whole process started all over again. So just when we had kind of finished all of my mom's chemo and radiation, and she was just kind of on some maintenance tamoxifen, and then we started over. And I had both of my grandparents actually had cancer as well, and they all went through the same cancer center in Iowa, in Mason City, Iowa, and I think they felt like they knew the Peterson family well, right? Because they took care of so many members of our family. So my dad went through all of his treatment for his colon cancer. His colon cancer, he had just a huge tumor, and they actually did not think he would do well compared to my mom's breast cancer tumor, which was much, much smaller. But it turns out my dad was great, finished his chemo, his radiation, and did awesome. And then just a couple of days before I was to graduate from high school, my mom went in. She kind of had some chest pain. They thought maybe she had pneumonia. She took a chest x-ray, and there was cancer on her ribs. And so she went and had scans done and had metastatic breast cancer all over, in her liver and all her bones. And so then everything kind of changed again. And I remember many people in my small town saying, "Are you still going to go away to college?" Right? We had a little 2-year college right in town, so everyone kind of assumed that I would switch and just sort of stay home. But my mom was quite insistent that I go off to college. They moved me into the dorms, and that day, actually, they moved me in. My mom fell on the stairs in my dorm room and broke her hip because it was so full of cancer. And they didn't tell me, interestingly. My parents just packed up in the pickup truck. I gave my mom like a kiss goodbye through the window. I had no idea why they were just taking off like that suddenly, but they didn't want me to worry. And she, of course, was in a lot of pain with a broken hip. So I was sent off, and they told me weeks later, actually, that she had broken her hip because they did not want me to change, to, decide not to go away to school and not to stay. So, I mean, that was a lot of just what ended up happening. So one summer in college, then I spent a summer at the cancer center with the doctor who had treated all 4 members of my family, and worked with them as my mom's cancer was getting worse. She ultimately died over Christmas break of my junior year. So anyway, and that was junior years, the year you kind of decide, right? And so I wrote my personal statement saying I didn't really know if this was a good or bad. And I remember my very first sentence was, "I'm looking to go to medical school because of and in spite of what has happened with my mom." So that's kind of how my med school journey ended up beginning. I got accepted to the University of Iowa, which was a great place to go to school, and obviously far cheaper for me too, since it was in state, and uh, started on there.
Yeah.
And then I
Well,
met my husband in medical school as well. So
oh,
yes, so
So
that was great too.
with that though, because there's these different kind of themes that we see when people go to medical school, and this one really is because you had medical experiences with your family, it sounds like. So because of that, did you have any expectations of what medical school would be like for you, or was it more just the path that you saw towards the final destination?
Yeah, it was hard. I mean, it was really challenging because I was worried that I would think too much about my mom and about stuff that was going on with my mom. I know that last summer before she ultimately died, she died of breast cancer, but she really died of heart failure because the only drugs that actually would work against the cancer was like adriamycin, which ended up affecting her heart and putting her into heart failure. I remember sitting in her hospital room one day, and I of course would lay against her, and I could hear her heart, and it just sounded weird. And the medical students came in with the attending physician, and they were listening to the heart, and of course they're being grilled. And the attending physician said, "What animal does her heart sound like? What does it sound like?" And this poor girl really had no idea what to say. And I, of course, had heard my mom. And I thought to myself, well, it sounds like a horse galloping, because she had this, I mean, that's what her heart sounded like. And of course, I was right. And that poor medical student, I can't even remember what she said. She said some animal just like made up on the spot because she had no clue. But I know my mom said to me, if you're going to do this, you have to promise me that you'll get someone to clean your house and you'll get someone to do things, because she was really worried about what my family life would be like. And she knew she wouldn't be around to be able to help me. So,
wow. Yeah. I think about, just, the training that you go through, and the things that you've been through with your immediate family during, your upbringing, and what drew you into medicine. And, despite that intention of helping people and making a difference, was there a point in your medical school training, or even you went into pediatrics, or in your residency,
yes.
that just, because I think it's good for us to highlight, especially for other physicians that may feel like they're alone. Is there anything that, from the outside looking in, you have a certain perception of medicine? Did anything shift, or anything change at some point in your training? You realize something wasn't right, or not what you thought?
Very much so, I would say. The year between our first and second year of medical school at the University of Iowa, they had this program called MECO, where you could go out into the community. And a lot of times you went to a family practice office and you stayed there for the summer. And I actually went back to that Mason City, Iowa, where my family had all been treated, and stayed there. And I did a different week in all of these specialties. I just did 1 week in everything. So 1 week in surgery, 1 week in OBGYN, 1 week in family practice, 1 week in pediatrics. And that is when things changed for me, because originally I really felt like my mom had kind of called me to do that a little bit. I was thinking more along treating adults and just this calling that I needed to do something beyond myself, I guess. And when I hit that week of pediatrics, I never wanted it to end. It was just so fun. I mean, I just loved it. I loved taking care of the kids. I loved the other pediatricians I was working with. It just felt right. And it was totally different than what I had felt before. And instead of this like desire and feeling that I needed to help others and do things for others, it just became more fun for me. And absolutely loved it. And then from that point on, everything kind of changed to point me in that way of doing pediatrics for good and forever.
Yeah.
And it's funny too, my first rotation of my third year, I started in surgery, and I went to the VA hospital, which, you can't get much different than from pediatrics than doing surgery at a VA hospital. But I went through, and the chief resident went through all of us brand new third year medical students, and he pointed to us and he told us what we were going to do. And he got to me and he said, pediatrics. And I was so mad that he pigeonholed me like that, but he was 100% right. I mean, I am a pediatrician. That's just what I am, and that's how I am, and it just fits for me. So
yeah, I'm curious, when did you start having children during your career?
We had our kids our second year of residency. So
Okay.
I met my husband formally the first day of our second year of medical school. It was really funny the way it turned out, because he had sort of seen me the first year and had made it a goal he was going to meet me the second year. He'd like circled me in the little herd book, and we had sort of said a couple of words, but I actually hadn't remembered. It was kind of funny because in hindsight, he broke his arm the first year, and I would catch him staring at me occasionally, and I thought he was totally creepy. And it was not until after we started dating that my best friend said, that's the guy with the broken arm that you used to think was creepy. And like, oh my gosh, it is. I just didn't even remember. But the first year of our second year, or first day of our second year, we had to go get our medical school textbooks. And it was a student-run bookstore. And it just a very small room. And it was open for 45 minutes a day over lunch. And if you got in the room within the 45-minute window, you could get your textbooks. And if you didn't, you'd have to come back the next day and get your textbooks. So I'm standing in line with some of my girlfriends, and we didn't really think there was any way we were going to make it in that day. But at the last second, the girl is coming to close the door, and my now husband, Eric, scooted over so that my girlfriends and I could get in. Because, of course, he had this ulterior motive, right? Because he had wanted to meet me. So he scooted in, we got in, and I didn't even bring my book list. So I didn't even know what books I needed. So it struck up a conversation with him because we're the same year, and he was showing me which books that I needed. So, and he seemed like a nice guy. And then the next day I show up to pathology small group, and there he is in my small group. And there are only like 10 or 12 people in the small group. So he walks me home that day because we only lived a block apart. And and then we started dating the next week, and 15 months later we were married. So
wow,
it was kind of whirlwind then.
Like from creeper to helper to husband.
Exactly. Exactly.
How well did he engineer that?
I know
he knew the person in the bookstore is like, hey, this is the plan.
I know this is the plan. It totally worked for him though. Yeah. I say we fell in love over, the microscope looking at liver pathology and things like that. But
so I think that's really interesting because my wife and I met in medical school as well. And so I think that provides a little extra, an interesting dynamic. And so the first kind of stressor, well, not the first, but one of the major stressors later on was when we were looking at matching. So how did you guys navigate that process, or did choices of residency influence that at all? Because your husband, who's in another episode, Eric Larson, is an anesthesiologist, your peds. So did you guys couples match? How did you kind of work that out, or your interviews and things?
We did do a couples match, and it was a little challenging because at the time, anesthesia was not filling. It was the time that this Hillary care, which it's hard to even remember back that far, but there was all of this that anesthesia was going to kind of go by the wayside, and they were all going to be mid-levels. And so they were not filling these programs. And it was a little scary for Eric because he needed to obviously be in a good place with good training. So we went through all of these we interviewed all over the place. We went out to the East Coast and we interviewed a bunch in Chicago, and all of these choices. And then we ultimately decided that the best place for us to stay was right there in Iowa City. So we ended up putting Iowa City Couples Match as our first choice because it had a really excellent anesthesia program with a lot of regional anesthesia, which he liked. And then they had a very good pediatrics program. So that's what we put first. But, going down the line, I think third, we had him training in Madison, Wisconsin, and me training in Milwaukee, and us living somewhere in the middle, which would have been disaster, but I'm glad it worked out. We ended up being able to stay right there in Iowa City and bought our first little house there in Iowa City, and it was perfect, really.
Yeah.
And that's like when we started our family. So
yeah.
We had our first child when we were in our second year of residency, and then pediatrics is only 3 years and anesthesia is 4. So I stayed around there an extra year. I did a little bit of locums, but for the most part, I had our second child and was able to be home with him for a while until we moved to Michigan.
And one kind of a little bit extra on there, because of course I'm fascinated because we have similar experiences, because we had our first child during internship.
Mm-hmm.
We had our second child during residency. My wife did family medicine. I did anesthesia. So the debate is always, when's the best time to have kids? And so ultimately you did it during residency, but did you find that challenging, or do you think that was better knowing what you know now about early practice environment? Like if you were, someone listening to this who maybe is in residency or medical school and thinking, well, I'm already trying to learn all this stuff. I have to match for residency and I'm kind of thinking about starting a family. What do you think? Like, what, in your opinion, what do you think is the better time to do it?
I mean, it was not easy for sure. We got pregnant our first year, our intern year, but we had a miscarriage. So that was certainly hard too. We were just like 13 weeks. So I had just started kind of telling people, and I miscarried. And then we ended up getting pregnant again and having our daughter a year to the day after the miscarriage, which was also my husband's birthday. So I miscarried on my husband's birthday, which I felt like was the worst thing. And I was going to ruin my husband's birthday forever. And then the next year we gave birth on that very same day. So that was kind of a beautiful thing to have that happen. But it was hard. We fortunately, being in that university environment, there was a daycare that had super extended hours that they opened at 6 something in the morning and didn't close until after 7 or 8 p.m. Oh. So you could have your child there for a long time. And then we had a little code on our pager system as to when we were done. We would send a little code to each other as to who was going to go to the daycare and pick up our daughter. And then there was 1 month that I was in the NICU and he was in the SICU, and it just honestly wasn't going to work. We weren't going to be able to do this because I was on call every third night and he was on call quite often as well. And actually, I think it was that I was working nights. That's what it was. I was working nights and he was on call like every third night. So we had a friend of mine who is a poet, who has a pretty flexible schedule because she is actually a professional poet. She moved into our house and lived there for a month and took care of our baby girl while Eric and I worked, and I slept in the daytime and she just watched her. She wrote some very beautiful poetry about my daughter, actually. I say to this day, that's why my daughter turned out to be such an excellent writer, is that 1 month that she was cared for by a poet. So
wow. That's super, super creative in a couple of ways.
Yeah. And then we had my second, and still we're just busy, right? And Eric's working and I was done with my residency now, but we had to have this whole plan as to whichever day of the week I went into labor on. We had this person that was going to be able to take our daughter and all this stuff. So it ended up, when I went into labor, I, of course, called my OB, who was another resident. We had started at the same time, and so we were close. And that day of the week, her husband was the one who was like on call to take our daughter. So we had to get a hold of her, not only because we needed her to deliver the baby, but we needed her husband, even more importantly, to take care of our toddler, because Eric was like down with her in the hospital cafeteria trying to eat breakfast, waiting for him to show up, for the two of them to show up, for her to deliver the baby and for him to take our toddler. So,
Oh my goodness.
The crazy
but you're
thing-
right. You have to think outside of the box, right? And
it's just so crazy.
we just didn't want to wait until we were in our 30s and then start the family. We were excited to start a family. And so if you're excited, you just get creative and you make it work. And that's what we did.
And I think that's important though, because, you know, there's a lot of delaying, right? People, they're going to perfect time. And I finally come to the, you know, you just, there's never a perfect time. I mean,
No.
outside of regular life, I don't think there's a perfect time, but if you're a physician, there really isn't a perfect time. So you do what you need to do when you need to do it, and it's done.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
And I, of course, you know, you see all those statistics about how your fertility rates start dropping, and then you get panicked. Like, if I wait too long, will I have trouble getting pregnant? It's easier to just maybe go now and deal with it, right? And figure it out. So.
Yeah. And if you have a residency program that facilitates that, that always helps too. Like,
Yes.
we were pretty lucky. And I think certain residents, I'd be shocked if pediatrics was hardcore and mean about pregnancy.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I took some time off, obviously. And because Eric's residency was a full year longer than mine, then I was able to take off. I ended up having preeclampsia and having to go spend the last week or 10 days in the hospital. So I had about 7 weeks off, like a week or so before, and then 6 weeks after. And so I just ended my residency almost 2 months late because it really wasn't going to be a big deal because Eric was going to be there anyway. So it worked out pretty well. And you're right. Pediatrics, if anything, they love babies, obviously. So they're more understanding than probably some others might be.
Oh, new patients coming. Yeah.
Yes, right.
Right. Well, in the same vein as we're kind of speaking of family and making babies and all of this, I was thinking it might be worthwhile just tapping into this idea of, you know, like Kevin is married to someone who's a physician and you are, and I'm married to someone who's not a physician. We don't have children. Like, we don't have all these elements that, you know, you and Kevin have in similarity, but I'm wondering your take on the pros and cons of being married to a physician versus a non-physician. Any take on that you think is good or not so good?
Yeah, I thought it was really good because we could understand each other and understand what we were going through. I mean, when we were medical students, our date nights oftentimes was just sitting in a quiet space and studying. And we didn't have to, you know, I just don't think it was easier because we understood that's what we had to do. We had these exams coming up, we would study. There was somebody that we graduated with who I had gone to college with, and he ended up becoming an anesthesiologist. So he knew Eric better. He obviously going in knew me better. And he dated a girl in college. They got married right before he went to medical school. And I remember this girl talking, just overhearing her, how she was bragging, how she was marrying this guy and he was going to be a doctor and they were going to have all this money and all this stuff. And it didn't make it past about the third year of medical school. I mean, their marriage just did not last. It was just, I think, a big thing to overcome. And ultimately, by the time he got into residency, he ended up marrying a nurse from the hospital who kind of understood things much better, right? So he ended up with a completely different person. And then I became friends with her and helped her with breastfeeding their first one since I had done so. And so we could just see that, right? You could see, and so many couples ended up getting married within our medical school class. Another funny story with us is we got married in the middle of our third year of medical school. And I, of course, had 2 roommates, and he had a roommate, and we were in the middle of our lease, and we didn't want to give up our lease, but we really wanted to get married. So he asked his roommate if he would be willing to move into my room and live with my 2 roommates, who were also in medical school. Well, it turns out he ended up marrying one of my roommates. So they didn't even know each other really before that day. And they kind of went out to dinner right before, and then, yeah, eventually they couples matched and got married. So,
Yeah.
You're bringing back all these memories I had totally forgotten about.
Yeah.
When is your anniversary? I just have to know.
December 12th.
Okay, because ours is January 21st, because it was the middle of our third year that we ended up getting married, and all those kind of concerns and things. But I think that's an interesting point, though, and an important point that you made, Melissa, is again, just like the child thing, there's never necessarily a good time, but being a physician, and this has been a common theme in a lot of our episodes, you simply don't know what it really is like until you're in the midst of an experience. And it is very difficult, I think, for somebody who's not in that environment to truly understand what it's like. Mm-hmm. So I can just see if someone was married before medical school and all of a sudden they're losing their spouse, right? And they think, well, you're not spending time with me. And it's not because they don't want to spend time with you. It's because there is such a huge demand on their time. Mm-hmm. That can be very, very challenging for people who don't kind of have that experience built into it to really understand it, to process and understand where their spouse or significant other is coming from.
Yeah, and I think Eric and I did a very good job when we were in our rotations and doing stuff. People did not even know that we were married. We were very much professional that way. We were in our psychiatry rotation in our third year of medical school, and we were getting married on December 12th, a Saturday. And our psychiatry exam was supposed to be on the 11th. And so we went to the program director and asked if there was any way we could take the exam on the late in the day on the 10th instead, because our families were all coming in on the 11th. And we said, yeah, could we take that test a day early, like at 4 or 5 o'clock? Would that be fine? We're getting married. And the response was, to each other? Yep, we're getting married to each other, because they had no idea. Our first rotation together, I had, this is months before that, but we were engaged already. We were in neurology, and I had a horrible migraine. It was just absolutely terrible. And I was really going to have to go home early. And they, of course, saw that I had an engagement ring on and said, well, can somebody come get you? Can your fiance come and get you? And I look across the table where Eric is sitting, and I just said, no, he can't. I didn't say that's him. I just no, he can't. I can make it home. I'll just walk home. And Eric said nothing either. I mean, we just didn't.
That is so funny.
And then another time we were in our internal medicine rotation, and it was an away rotation. We went to Des Moines, and we were sitting there waiting to do rounds with the attending. And the attending looked at Eric's name tag and then looked at mine, and then back to Eric, and then back to mine. And then he gets this tiny little smile on his face, and he said, are you married to each other? Yes, we are. So we just never really let on to people. They would figure it out eventually sometimes, and sometimes didn't. But
you didn't have anybody go, it's really funny. You guys both have the same last name.
Right.
That's so bizarre that they had no idea.
I know.
So crazy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, if we could, I'd love to hear more about your story as it pertains to your private practice in the last few years and how things shifted. Mm-hmm. Do you mind taking that story there?
Yeah. Yeah. Things were good here, right? I went into private practice and pediatrics, and my husband is in private practice anesthesia. We ended up having another baby after we came here. So we had 3 kids. We had one foster son as well. So 3 biological children, 1 foster son. And I felt like things were good. Like life was good. And one day, August 15th of 2018, we were on our way to a minor league baseball game here in Grand Rapids. And it was an office event for me, actually. Our pediatrics office had rented out a deck of the baseball stadium, and that we could get unlimited food, and it was just going to be a really fun time. And originally, I was just going to go with the boys because Eric was on call. My daughter had a violin lesson, and my foster son was working. So I was just going with my 14-year-old Andy and my 12-year-old Peter. And I remember asking Peter, like, do you want to go? And he said, I think it'd be a great mother-son thing to do. So we decided to go ahead and do it, even if Eric couldn't go. And then at the very last second, it was just a really slow day in the OR. And suddenly Eric got out early. And so I asked at the office if there was an extra ticket, and they said yes. And so it was going to be this super fun event. And my son Peter didn't eat like all day because he was saving up room in his stomach. And my son Andy had just made the JV soccer team for his brand new high school. He was in orientation and he was at soccer practice, and he came home from soccer practice, and the four of us get in our minivan and are on our way, and things were good. You know, I feel like we were in such a good place with the family. And then as we were in that exit lane, a woman was distracted when she was driving. She was flying down the road at highway speeds, even though we were in an exit lane and there was construction, and she plowed right into the back of our van. I lost consciousness. Peter lost consciousness. Eric remained conscious, but Andy ultimately died. Eric tried for quite some time to revive him, and I came to, and it was just this horrific nightmare to have, and so hard being a physician who cares for people, right? Eric's an anesthesiologist. This is what he does. He intubates people. He puts in IVs. He, like, basically, you know, as you know, when you put someone to sleep for anesthesia, you sort of kill them and then bring them back. So he certainly thought he could bring Andy back. I'm a pediatrician. I take care of kids. This is what I do. And yet I could do nothing to save Andy. So that was crushing. And you just feel like you have this huge hole. I tried to go back to work after about 6 or 8 weeks. Eric went back after maybe 3 weeks or so, and he encouraged me to go back. He thought it would be good for me to get back to my patients, but it was incredibly hard because I do pediatrics, and everywhere there was a reminder, right? Everybody, every soccer player, every set of brothers, every buddy wearing a Michigan State sweatshirt, which was his favorite team, they all reminded me of Andy, and all these like whole families. And suddenly having to talk to crying moms about how they can't get their kid to sleep, or somebody who's had the sniffles for 3 hours, I just couldn't do it. I cried between every single patient for weeks. And I just had this fog too. I mean, I felt like I wasn't remembering medications like I should. I wasn't coming up with medical terms like I should. I now know that's just kind of a grief brain that you just kind of get. And so ultimately I had to take a leave of absence and leave practice, which that was almost a full year that I left pediatrics. It was just too difficult. So several months after I had left, I started thinking about finding a way to kind of help myself be able to start to heal. And my husband does a podcast, and I thought, certainly there's a podcast for grieving parents. There's a podcast for everything, right? I will find a podcast and I'll start listening to that and see if I can get some help and insight from that. And I looked and looked and I could find nothing. And Eric came home and I said, I have been looking for a podcast on grief and I don't think there is one. And he thought I was crazy, right? So he starts looking and looking and he goes, no, you're right. There isn't one. And I said, I think I'm supposed to start one, which was so unlike me because I am not, he's the podcast person. I don't even listen to podcasts. Why all of a sudden I thought I should do one. And then Eric, of course, really started encouraging me and that I think this is what you're supposed to do. I think you're supposed to do this podcast and try to help families and help other parents. And so ultimately I did. It was almost a year ago now. It'll be a year in just a couple of weeks that I started my podcast and launched it. And on my podcast, I primarily speak with parents who have lost their kids, with moms and dads. And I've got an expert that comes on every few weeks too. And we talk about a different aspect of grief. You know, occasionally there'll be an author, sometimes people who have lost their siblings, but through that, I really kind of found my way again. And I found that I was able to really help these parents and help normalize what they're going through, because you just feel so isolated and alone. You are not supposed to outlive your children. That's not the order of things, right? And I thought I knew grief. I mean, I told you at the beginning of this podcast, I lost my mother. I thought I understood what grief was like, and I was wrong. Losing your child is so much different. You know, I've heard it said that losing your parents is like losing your past, and losing your spouse is losing your present. Losing your kids is losing your future, losing part of yourself. And it just was entirely different. And I needed to find something to do to be able to get through that grief, work through that grief, and help other people, because ultimately that's what I am, right? I'm someone who is a caregiver. I care for families, and I wanted to help care for broken families that I didn't even know. So that's what's happened. And my podcast is now, I've been in every state and I think 40 or 50 countries. And I have people contacting me from all over that want to be on. I have people reach out and say, your podcast has been a lifeline. I didn't want to get out of bed until I listened to an episode, and that made me be able to get out of bed this morning. I mean, those types of stories I hear. And then for me personally, it gave me something to do with my grief, something I could do with Andy, the two of us together, that ultimately made it possible for me to go back and practice medicine and be a pediatrician again, because I could separate that out a little bit. You know, overall, I actually think I'm a better pediatrician than I was before, because I just have this insight and understanding pain even more. And now if I see someone whose child's had the sniffles for a few hours or a fever for 2 hours, I'm actually more sympathetic, because I think about, wow, you must really be worried, right? That is a really worried parent who feels like they need to bring their child in that soon. And my job then is to try to comfort them and decrease that worry, because ultimately I'm not worried about the 3 hours of sniffles at all, but I need to get the parents so they're not worried about it, you know?
Yeah.
Such a powerful perspective shift. When you're saying that is, I mean, grief is so, grief, I'm trying to remember the actual quote from Khalil Gibran's The Prophet, where but the summary is basically is like grief and pain. They carve these furrows in your soul,
Mm-hmm.
but it's because of those furrows where your joy starts to fill in again. It carves a space where you can really appreciate these things that perhaps we didn't see as much before, or reach out to other people in other ways. Because when you were talking about, when you talk to pediatricians, they're also, it's the parents you have to worry about. The kids are always fine, and the parents are there. It's only 3 weeks of, 3 hours of sniffles or whatever. But I just love that perspective, and how much empathy and compassion has come out of this, where you can now say, instead of, oh, that parent is overreacting, it comes, just look how concerned they are. How much do you want to protect this child? And I think it's definitely a powerful lesson for a lot of us who can get burned out in these systems, and we feel like oftentimes that patients are taking away from us. And to just recognize that everybody has, those 3 hours of sniffles for them can be a big deal, and it's up to our perspective as to how can we facilitate and help them through that. It's not a judgment of us, really. We shouldn't be judging them. We should be really caring for people. So,
and every grieving parent I've talked to has said that they're a more compassionate person after they lost their child. And not one of us wouldn't exchange that back. I would much rather have my son and be less compassionate. But because I did lose my son, that is a result. And really, I think all of us are.
I'm thinking about the fact that you're a physician, especially a pediatrician, and you found that there was nobody doing a podcast on this topic, not to the degree that you were looking for. It makes me think of just how so many people weren't willing to go there, and that despite the fact that no one would want to go through what you went through, neither would you, and the pain that you had to endure, the fact that you are, in a sense, from what I'm getting from you, is a sense of purpose and mission, that this is what you're intended to do because of what has happened to you. It seems like because I think of just our training as physicians and what we have to endure just merely from a training perspective, aside from the emotional aspects of family and relationships, just what we deal with. I almost think in the canvas of your life and what you endured with losing your parents and your mother at that time, and your training, and then the pain of losing your child, it just shows me the strength, the kind of person that was needed to put themselves in that space where not a lot of people are willing to go. And I'm super grateful for, it could be any of us that could go through what you've gone through. And I'm just really glad that you have that out there. And it's andysmom.com is that .com, correct?
Yep.
For those listening. And I listened to the episode you did as a guest with your husband on his podcast. We'll have in the show notes. But I just couldn't help but think about how it took someone to have the strength and the courage and the tenacity. And it probably didn't hurt that your husband had already kind of started a podcast. You probably had this, the microphone and kind of knew
we had absolutely everything.
Yeah.
And so, he said, even now, he does a great podcast. His podcast is on healthcare, but he will tell anyone who asks that he feels like the reason that he started his was that I would have mine, because he feels like mine is so important and can be so valuable to people. So
yeah. He did actually say that in the interview. So it was exactly what he said.
But it is such an important piece, because you also said one of those factors with grief is how isolated you feel. And when you are going something so horrific and you feel like you're the only person in the world who's experiencing that, not only are you dealing with the trauma, but that lack of connection, I think, as humans it's just so profound. So the fact that you went out and you provided a space out there for families that that know that, yeah, this is horrible, this is awful, feels like unbearable, but you can bear it, and here's others who have.
Mm-hmm.
Just so
And
powerful.
the other key thing is to be okay with sitting in this sad, dark place, because so many people feel like they need to make you feel better. Like they need to say, oh, this is all part of God's plan, or, oh, he's in a better place. Or, I mean, I had one phlebotomist. My son got his blood drawn, and she asked how many kids or how many brothers and sisters he had. And of course he gets kind of teared up and he says he has a sister. And she said, you don't sound happy about that. And I said, well, he had a brother who recently died. And her response back was, well, you've got to look on the bright side. And I thought, okay, there's really no bright side here. It should have been, I'm so sorry. Right. And just leave it and not feel this pressure. Like you have to try to make it better, because no one will make this better. You just need to live through it and start to get better on your own with time, bits of healing. You can't tell someone to be better. You need to kind of show it and live it instead. Yeah. So when I see people further along in the journey than me, and I see them doing well, that gives me hope. It doesn't give me hope to have someone say, oh, he's in a better place. Because my response back in my head is, but I want him here. Yeah. I don't care right now, right? Or we had a wonderful funeral service, and it was very God honoring, and Andy had a strong faith, and people would say, wow, that funeral service brought people to Christ. My response back was, that wasn't the point, and I don't care. Yeah. We had that funeral service because that honored my son in the best way that it could, and it showed who he was and what was important to him. And if it brought people to Christ, great. But that was not the goal. You know, I wasn't having some altruistic kind of goal here. Yeah. I'm missing my boy. And so to have people kind of say those platitudes, I think bothered me so much too, which is another reason to start the podcast. The podcast is for grieving parents, but it's also for just other people who know someone who lost their child. And I've had a ton of those people reach out to me too, just to say, wow, that was really helpful. I know it's much better for me to sit next to them in silence now, to say, I have no words for you. I know I can't make this better right now, but I'm here. I'm showing up. And I'm going to come tomorrow and ask you to go for a walk, or I'm going to offer to do this for you, but I'm not going to say these platitudes that will make you just angry. Because trust me, every parent that hears those platitudes gets angry. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You know, you make me feel this sense of, and I think it's a lesson for all of us, and feel free to correct me, but I feel like in this day and age where there's a lot of busyness, there's a lot of distraction, there's a sense of not wanting to be uncomfortable and getting your way and having things the way you want it, and just trying to have as much positive feeling all the time. And I feel like the biggest lesson for a lot of us is just to truly to be aware and identify the feelings and be present, whether it's in somebody else that's going through something such as grieving the loss of, tragic loss of your son, and being okay with that, and knowing that this is a process that you need to be present for that person in whatever way they need you. And because of that, I think you willing to take on this podcast, knowing that you are reliving in a very vocal, global way, literally a global way, what you had gone through, and reliving that over and over again. I know there's some people out there that would not want to put themselves in that place, but do you think it's because you have come to terms with feeling those emotions and being okay with it, that I guess I'm curious about your outlook on going through this kind of project or this mission or for the world. How do you see what you're doing, and how does it make it easier to heal, or do you feel like there's times where it's hard to relive those moments?
There are certainly episodes that I do that are more difficult than others, right? There are episodes when I talk to parents where I can feel pretty down afterwards, but overall, it is so encouraging to me. Recently, earlier this summer, I was a guest for a group of third-year medical students that were just starting their clinical years. And I talked about compassion in medicine, and I talked about my story and about just needing to be that way and to be present for your patients and to know that you are not going to always be able to make things better, and to be able to be comfortable with that, with the fact that you can't always fix it, especially emotionally, if you can be emotionally present to patients. That was very powerful to them. I mean, we had some very nice feedback. Some med students that had overall been starting to get even a little bit disillusioned with medicine, that they had gone in with this idea that they were going to be able to be compassionate and help people. And then as things were going, there was like, oh, this isn't what medicine is like at all. And now to hear me talk about it, then they realized, well, it still can be. And it probably is better that it is. You know, I think back to my residency, and we lost patients. I had kids die, obviously. And I felt like forever there was one patient that I really messed up on, right? Because for the most part, I stayed solid. I did not shed a tear. I stayed strong. I felt for the families, but I was tough. But there was one family where I took care of this girl on and off for a year, because she was in our peds ICU for a year. She was a heart patient. And so I got to know this family well. I would talk to the parents at nighttime, and in the middle of the night when we were on call, I would chat with them. And so I got close to them. And so that little girl died when I was taking care of her, but it was about an hour and a half before I came in the morning. So I walked in that morning totally unsuspecting, and she had died. And her mom was in there holding her, dead 1-year-old. And I was like, I got to go in there. I mean, I know this family well. I've got to go in there. And I went in there and I started to cry. Mm-hmm. And I hugged that mom with her dead baby between us. And I felt like I am screwing this up so badly. And I remember her saying to me, Marcy, you are going to be an amazing general pediatrician. And in my mind, what I thought she was saying was, man, you screwed this up. You better not be an ICU doc, because you are crying. But that wasn't what she was saying at all. What she was saying was, you feel for your families and your patients so much that you're going to be a great doctor to them someday. And I did not know that is what she meant until my own son died. And all of a sudden I had this revelation of, that's what she really meant. Because I've talked to other parents whose kids have died in the hospital, and, one whose baby died of heart problems, and they went back to visit and they saw the cardiac fellow, and she started to cry in the hallway, and she said, oh, I told myself I wasn't going to do this. I'm so sorry I'm doing this. And to that mom, who's a friend of mine, she was like, that was the most amazing gift to me, to see her cry. And to see that she cared, and that she still missed us, and she missed Blake. That was her little boy's name. And so it changed everything about what I thought was important to be a doctor. Now, that being said, you can't fall apart and be a puddle and have your patients feel like they need to take care of you, right? You have to still show some strength and be able to be the one that they are hugging and that they are turning to. But to show that humanity and the fact that you care is actually helpful to those families and not a sign of weakness.
Yeah. I'm kind of speechless for a second. I mean, I just kind of, that just kind of hit me in the core because I've had a few encounters myself that way. And yeah, the stoic is the traditional aspect of me, but deep down I'm an empath, and it's really hard to just see the pain in somebody else. And it almost feels like a necessity. At some point you feel like you've got to show that.
Yeah.
It's important.
And I think to the families, they really do appreciate it. I mean, I know that it's important to be able to see a little bit of that compassion, that you're not just a number to them. You're not just a diagnosis to them. You're not going to go home and just be the same after seeing their loss, that they meant something to you.
Yeah.
And I think that's such a hard part about medicine is how do we express compassion? You know, we want to express compassion, but you think about some of these moments that we're put in, where there's this kind of strength and compassion mix that you have to have, and a lot of times we haven't learned it.
No.
You know, and you're gonna be put into it. If you go into medicine, it will happen at some point. But really, we have not, at least again in my medical school, you don't really have a chance to really truly understand what that means. And when we see this war where people are put up the walls and like, well, I am the physician, and so how I'm going to benefit my patients is become the wall, right? Where they can break their grief upon, or like you said, I just love that balance. What you're saying is you express compassion, but your compassion is there for your patient. And if it goes too far where your patient now has to take care of you as the physician, that's probably when we've kind of reel it back a little bit and sort of.
You have to. You can't. I've had that as just a grieving mom, not with other physicians, but with other people. You know, when I have other people come up to me and now they're sobbing and I feel like I'm supposed to comfort them, that's a mess, right? That shouldn't happen. I think back to just a friend that we have who really fell apart to us. It made like my daughter feel super uncomfortable. It made me feel super uncomfortable. You can't make that family member feel like they have to take care of you at all. But so it's the balance. It's the balance of strength with compassion. And that's why I spoke to those medical students in Chicago this last summer, is to just try to talk about that, about showing strength with compassion and not just this strength, turn off all the emotions.
Yeah. It's if you can show your feelings, but not lose yourself.
Yes.
You know. Yeah. Kevin, any last question?
Well,
I think
this is so much
officially our longest, most wonderful interview.
We can talk so long, but I do want to respect your time, and so I want there's a couple points that I want to make sure that we don't miss. Your podcast is always Andy's mom, if I'm remembering that correctly.
Andy's.
It's actually called Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom.
Okay.
Eric made me put the Losing a Child in front of it because he didn't think people may find it if I didn't have that in the front. So that's the title of the podcast, Losing a Child, Always Andy's Mom. The website is andysmom.com. On Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I am always Andy's mom.
All right. And then I think that we'll end it here. Do you have we have the podcast, a Facebook page, but if somebody who maybe is struggling or has questions for you, is there a way that you would prefer they contact you?
Yes. My email address is Marcy, M-A-R-C-Y, @andysmom.com. And I am happy to talk to people. A lot of people reach out and I talk to them. Some of them I even text regularly, parents now, and have formed beautiful friendships with people in other parts of the country. If you want to share your story, I love to share stories. That is really what I'm doing here. People love to talk about their kids. And our biggest fear as grieving parents is that our children will be forgotten. So one of the things that I can do for parents is I can give them a platform to talk about their child again. This is why I'm always Andy's mom, because in other aspects, I'm not called Andy's mom anymore. I'm Peter's mom, I'm Catherine's mom, but I'm not called Andy's mom. So it's to remember that I am always Andy's mom, and to be able to, those moms that can write and sign their name as Nathan's mom or Chris's mom or Abby's mom one more time, it's just beautiful. And for me to be able to help them share their stories with the public so people can hear about their amazing children, it's just a gift that I feel like I'm able to give, and parents love it. They love to be able to talk about their kids. Mm-hmm.
Well, again, thank you so much. This has been a fantastic episode. I just love talking to you and hearing all your experiences and your knowledge, wisdom that you've learned through these experiences. And yeah, so thank you. Just thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me.
Well, we'll think of something. We're going to bring you back. So
okay,
we're getting you on right now. We're going to have you back for something. But everybody else out there, I appreciate, I hope that you got as much or even half as much as I got out of this episode, whether you have kids or you don't have kids. Certainly bring a physician, gives you a little bit more perspective on this. Again,
one other point, if any of your listeners do have access to medical school students or have residents that they work with, I really do also feel called to try to help with the training of future physicians and helping them kind of try to find this mix of strength and compassion in medicine. So I am so happy to be able to do Zoom conferences or whatever to talk to other physicians in training. So anyway, that would be another thing that I would love to be able to do.
You've given so much already, but thank you. Thank you so much. And it's a fantastic resource for something that is extraordinarily difficult and challenging. And we really don't have that skill set. So I appreciate that you're willing to help people through that process. Is medical students need it, residents need it, physicians in practice need it, and certainly if you're a parent or a friend of a parent, we're going to need it as well. So I really appreciate that.
All right, thank you.
And for everybody else out there, this is the Change Physician Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Kevin Kukara, with my wonderful co-host, Dr. Melissa Cady, and our fantastic guest, Dr. Marcy Larson. Thank you so much for joining us today.